Neutral is a place of no movement. It means you're not making progress towards the goals or the ideas that are really important to you. Welcome to Beyond Neutral, where we talk about what gets you stuck and how we can shift and navigate the road forward. As leaders, as professionals in our careers, or just balancing and creating the kind of life you desire. I'm your host, Paula Reed. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond Neutral. So this week I was working on a project in my search business, and it sparked this interest in the topic that I want to talk to you about today, which is the topic of humility. I was checking a reference on a candidate who's being considered for a senior executive role. And in the process of checking the reference, I was asking about, you ask about strengths, you ask about what a person's behavior is like, what they're like as a leader. You ask all trying to basically get a feel for what somebody's soft skills are that they're bringing into an organization. So what they're capable of doing, but also how they go about doing it. And the comment was made that perhaps the greatest strength this person brought as an individual and as a leader was their humility. They said they're just an incredibly humble individual. I started thinking about that concept of humility. And anytime you read anything about leadership, they will talk about humility being one of the really key aspects of effective leadership. But in truth, humility is one of the key aspects of really strong relationships. And a person who is really able to step into and lean into relationships of any kind and make connection really well, humility can be an amazing attribute or virtue that you're bringing into any relationship, whether that be personal, whether that be professional, whether that be an intimate relationship. And so it was something I really wanted to think about and research and talk about today. And what I want to talk about around that is, first of all, why it matters. What's the benefit of it? And then secondly, what gets in the way of being humble? Because as I stepped back and really thought about it, it started me thinking about how many senior leaders I know who I would describe as incredibly humble. And what constitutes that? Like, what are the behaviors? How does that humbleness show up? So first of all, why does it matter? What is the benefit of having humility as a person? And what do you need in order to have it? The very first thing you need to have in order to have humility is a very strong ego. And by strong, I don't mean big. I mean strong, a solid, healthy. I think healthy is a better word for that. Okay. You need a healthy ego, meaning not that you are egotistical, but that you have a balanced perspective. You are comfortable in your own skin. You're not afraid to make mistakes. You're happy with who you are as a person and realize you have more to learn. It's really this contentment almost with who you are is what a healthy ego means. Okay. It's a level of personal security. A person who is very insecure sometimes appears to have an enormous ego. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a healthy ego. And a healthy ego is imperative in being humble. But being humble can also be something that helps confirm who you are, if you can kind of connect those things. So why does humility matter? Why is it a hallmark of an effective leader? And therefore, why is it perhaps important in any other kind of relationship? Effective leadership, part of it is prioritizing the needs of a team member, empowering others, creating a collaborative environment. And in order to do that comfortably, as a leader, you have to believe that you don't have all the answers. And the nature of believing you don't have all the answers is being humble about your level of knowledge and your level of insight into things, right? The same can be true in a friendship. The same can be true in a marriage, right? Recognizing that you may have certain things that you're very good at and certain things that you know, and others have other things that they bring to the table. And really being able to recognize that. That's a hallmark of humility. Humility also promotes gratitude because it encourages us to appreciate the contributions that others can make and can recognize kind of your own, I would say your own privileges, right? You can recognize your own and be content with your own privileges and your own values and not be insecure about the fact that you have them, but rather have gratitude for them. And you can appreciate the contributions that other people can offer to something. And that leads to a greater sense of perspective and, frankly, a greater level of contentment in life. Gratitude leads to contentment. I don't know if it's a fact, but it certainly is a validated outcome. Let me put it that way. Humility is also something that can really inspire others to be willing to step back, right? To be willing to allow other people to contribute, to allow other people to have a say, to allow other people to have a voice. So when you're humble as a leader or as a friend, again, you're also encouraging other people to offer because you don't know everything and you don't have everything and you don't have all the answers and you don't always have to be the voice. You're allowing other people a voice. You're promoting other people to rise and to contribute. So these are just some parts about why it matters to be humble. And I would say the very number one thing that humility offers you and the value of this is it offers you the opportunity to be wrong. One of the things in this particular conversation that I had, when I asked the question, I said, wow, tell me about how, when I was told this person's probably greatest strength is their humility, I said, how does that show up? Tell me how that shows up. And their response was, they're never afraid to admit they were wrong. They can send you down a road, they can give you information, and when they realize it wasn't the right thing, or when they realize they gave you, information that wasn't correct or took a position that wasn't correct, they're very willing to come back and say, hey, you know what? I realize that wasn't the right choice. I was wrong about that. And in doing that, you build trust in your relationships. You're demonstrating as a leader or even as a parent, as a spouse, again, you're demonstrating a culture and an ability to make mistakes. You're demonstrating a willingness to allow people to stretch a little bit, allowing people to try things and to fail a little bit because you're not afraid to fail. You're humble enough to realize you're not going to succeed every time. And in the process of doing that, you learn and you demonstrate a willingness to learn and a willingness to be open about, the choices that you made and maybe why they didn't go right and how you would do things differently. And a willingness to go back and say, let's rethink this and let's look at other data, or the willingness to say to somebody, I should have listened more to you. You really were on the right track there. And I minimized that, right? And being willing to admit you're wrong. So as a leader, being willing to admit you're wrong actually builds safety with the people who report to you. It does the same thing in a marriage. It does the same thing as a parent. It builds safety around making mistakes. And all of that is only possible if you're humble. It's only possible if you consider humility to be a virtue that you hold as important to you. Now, the question is, so we all know that's great, but what gets in the way? Because frankly, humility can be a really tough thing for people to have. It can be very difficult to kind of sit in that and be comfortable with it. So why is that? Well, like most things, number one is ego. And I mentioned that a little bit before. We naturally, humans have egos. Some of them are big and some of them are small, and we have a very significant desire within our egos for recognition and validation. And humility really requires us to set that aside. And that can be challenging We have to set aside our ego. We have to set aside our pride. We have to be willing to be vulnerable. And that can be really difficult for some people. And a lot of times when people hear the concept vulnerability, they think of these immense emotions like a teariness. But vulnerability can just simply show up as being willing to be wrong, being willing to be called out as not having been perfect, right? And having confidence in that. One of the other things, especially in a workplace where humility can become difficult is, we often measure our success in comparison to others. And in doing that, we can be very driven to showcase our achievements, right? And far less willing to showcase our mistakes. And so it can create a mindset where prioritizing humility is really not rewarded, right? And in fact, it's not only not rewarded, but sometimes it's looked upon as a weakness. We think of the misconception that humility lacks conviction, or it lacks assertiveness, or it's incompatible with our goals to achieve or to succeed. And it's not true. But that can be the story that we tell ourselves, or that can be the story within organizations or even in families. Man, I know in my family, I grew up, as I've said it before, the youngest of 7. And man, did we hold on to our positions and our opinions and our ideas. And being able to step up and admit you were wrong, that took some guts. And honestly, it's something that I have worked on and learned as I've gotten older. Okay. And it is definitely not something that was easy in my family. You needed to be able to hold your own. It was a dog-eat-dog world out there. And you really needed to be able to hold your own and feel like you were competitive there. And so being able to step back and say, wow, I was wrong about that, was difficult. And that got in the way sometimes. So it's a misconception often that being humble and being able to step back and being able to put your ego aside is a sign of weakness. And there's a fear that in showing that quote unquote weakness, we are going to be undermined somehow. The truth is actually just the opposite. And it's just the opposite on several levels. It's just the opposite in terms of both how people see you and quite often how you see yourself through that process. Because like so many things that I've talked about on this podcast, our ideas of what is going to happen to us when we allow ourselves to feel our emotions or to access our vulnerability, our idea of what's going to happen to us in those settings is usually, most of the time, never how they really are. And in truth, most of the time, we come out of those moments feeling far more empowered because we're living into the truth of who we are and what we are and what we're feeling. And in doing that, we gain strength and we gain confidence. Cultivating humility really requires a very significant level of self-awareness and introspection and a willingness to really be open and to value and respect others and what they can teach us and what we can learn from that. And mostly to appreciate what we can learn from not knowing and what we can learn from not being right. And those are all hallmarks of what humility is. And so I found it really interesting as I went through this reference summary that the word humility was only used once. But as I talked with 5 different people about this particular individual, all of the things that I just described, the ability to really listen to people, the real ability to really ask questions, to understand what other people could bring to the table or what they could learn from other people. Those were all kind of the behaviors that this person exhibited as an individual and as a leader. And what was so interesting is every single person I talked to made the point that how they were as a person was how they are as a leader. And we never can separate those things, quite honestly. So this willingness to listen, this willingness to make mistakes, this willingness to believe others have as much to offer as they do. All of those things were behaviors that everybody talked about. And finally, somebody named the virtue as being incredibly humble, and that the strength was actually in their humility. That is my thought of the day and the topic that I really wanted to talk about in how important humility is in not just in leadership, but in all the relationships that we have. The ability to recognize you don't know everything, the ability to be wrong. And that will lead to my next podcast, by the way, which is admitting you're wrong and apologizing. That's the next one. But right now we're dealing with humility. But all of those things, how much that enables us to have so much richer relationships with others. And fundamentally, that's because the more accepting we are of ourselves and our own limitations, the more willing we are to accept those in other people as well. And so as we accept others' limitations, we're able to learn from them. We're able to grow from them. We're able to meet them where they are. And we're able to enhance the kind of relationships that we have with people. So that is the topic of the day, humility. My goal is to take all that I learned about this particular individual and bring it into my own way of being and thinking and entering into situations and being willing to really listen deeply to learn what I can learn from other people and to be willing to be wrong and be completely okay with it. Humility. That's the ticket. Thank you so much for being here today. And yes, a little bit of insight into what I'm talking about next, which is when you are wrong, how do you go about admitting it? And how do you apologize for it when you need to? That is an art. It's an art form and one well worth pursuing. So in the meantime, I hope you're doing well. If you find this topic interesting or you would like to learn how to be more humble, I'm always happy to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time. Keep driving. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond Neutral. Make sure to visit our website, www.reidandco.com, for this week's show notes. That's reidnco.com. And if you found value in today's episode, I would really appreciate you giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All of this helps to support the show. Thanks so much. Take care.